Hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm gonna show you how to achieve this electricity effect in Blender. It's fully procedural and also quite interactive, so when you move it around, then you see this little trail disappearing afterwards. And also if you combine basically the fields of two objects, then the electricity between them interacts as well. This effect, however, is as you can see two-dimensional, so it only exists on the plane on which the object moves around with. But with few little changes and tweaks, we can make it three-dimensional so that it appears around the mesh. However, so far I didn't figure out how to make the three-dimensional version to leave trail, so you can only have it around the mesh, but it doesn't leave this nice trail effect as it did on that plane. If you don't feel like following the whole tutorial, you can also get the blend file on my Gumroad for free, so feel free to check it there, link in the description. And yeah, without further ado, let's see how it's done. First of all, let's delete everything and create a plane. You can also scale it up a little bit. And also make sure that in add-ons you have the node wrangler enabled, because we will use it later. So just type in node and you can see it, just make sure that it's checked. Before we jump into shading editor, we need to set up a little bit our plane. So first of all, let's go to the vertex group and under vertex colors, let's click this plus button to add a vertex color group. Let's change the name so that we can find it later easily. Now in the physics tab, let's add a dynamic paint modifier, and with type canvas, let's add a canvas with the plane selected. Here under output, let's delete those two, and in paint map layer, let's choose the vertex group that we created before. Alright, so next thing that we need to do is we need to add a object that we want to have the electricity effect be applied to, basically. We can use a UV sphere, and let's also add a dynamic paint modifier to it, but this time change the type from canvas to brush, add brush, and change the paint from mesh volume to volume plus proximity. And with this done, let's go back to the plane. And then let's jump into edit mode and add more geometry simply by using right mouse button and let's choose subdivide. And now with Shift R, we can just repeat the previous action. Let's do it a couple of times to give ourselves more vertices, which will be needed later to drive the vertex paint basically, which is gonna be our mask that will determine where the electricity effect is gonna appear. So right now we can directly jump into the shading editor. Let's add a new material, let's also name it. And we can already delete the principled BSDF as we will not need it. And we can add a vertex color node. And now if you hold down Ctrl Shift and left mouse button on the node, you can see the preview. And this basically is gonna be our mask. You cannot see anything, but if you click on the sphere and then in the dynamic paint modifier, you can see the distance. If you play with this value, this basically gonna give us the mask that we will use to drive the electricity effect. And then again, the more vertices you have on your plane, the more accurate this mask is gonna be. But don't go too crazy, because then the viewport may become laggy. So we already have the mask. We can adjust it a little bit later. Let's first focus on the electricity effect itself. So for this, we will need a Voronoi texture. Let's also click Ctrl T. And because we have node wrangler enabled, we will get these two nodes automatically, so we don't need to look for it. And let's duplicate this Voronoi texture once more and change mode from F1 to smooth F1. And using math node, we can combine both of the distances with the subtract instead of add. This will give us this result. Now make sure that both of the Voronoi textures are connected to the mapping node. And let's add another node, value node, and connect it to the scale. So we can easily control the scale of the whole electricity arcs. As you can see, there is like a lot of gray values. So in order to control that, basically the gradient, we can use a mix RGB node with the mode set to color burn and the second color set to black. Now with the factor, we can control the fall off, basically, of our electricity effect. We can also add another color mix. This time let's change it from color burn to color dodge and change the second color to white. And this will give us control over the brightest points. So if we crank it all the way up, then it's basically 1 and 0 mask. But we wanted something like this, maybe lower, maybe something like this. And this one a little bit, something like that. So we have a little bit of those thicker connections and some of the thinner ones, so that it gives us nice variation. Let's also play around with the scale maybe. Something should be okay. Now another thing that we have to do is add some variation, because right now it looks more like some gooey substance instead of electricity arcs. So in order to give it some noise, we will need another mix RGB node. And holding Ctrl, let's disconnect this vector and connect it to the mix RGB node output. And then we can connect this mapping node to mix RGB. And the second one is gonna be a noise texture, also color, and change the mix to linear light. Now it's a little bit too noisy, so let's bring down the factor, something like this, and maybe the roughness a little bit lower, because we actually will use two sets of variations. One is gonna be big scale, that is gonna basically just wobble the whole noise, and the second is gonna be fine detail that will affect those arcs directly. So the first one is like this, maybe add a little bit of distortion as well, but again not too much, you don't want to make it too noisy. And then we can copy this setup, and again holding Ctrl, let's disconnect this output and put it here, and this one goes in here, and here we can change the scale to something like 30. Now let's lower the factor quite a bit. We only want those little fine noise going. Yeah, maybe something like this. Maybe it's a bit too noisy. Don't worry about it too much, because you can always adjust it later when we will have the whole shader set up. So we can leave it as it is for now. Let's also make sure that we have all those noises connected to this mapping node, so that when we scale this value, everything scales uniformly. Right now let's bring down the roughness because it's way too strong. Something like this, maybe down. Okay, we can leave it as it is now. Now the last thing to do here is let's put a color ramp at the very end and change the interpolation from linear to constant. And this is gonna be basically the color of our electricity effect. So let's change it to something bluish, like this maybe. And we can add one more and put it all the way up and switch it to white, so that only the peaks are gonna get overblown and just be the pure white. Okay. So this looks fine for now. The very last thing is the animation of this effect. So let's bring up timeline. And to animate this we will use drivers. So let's change the noise texture from 3D to 4D, which is basically gonna give us this W value, which is something like a seed. And if we change that, then we affect the noise, the big and the small scale variations. Now we will use drivers to drive those noises, and drivers are basically gonna alternate the value depending on the frame that our timeline is on right now. So if you type in #frame and just play, then you can see that the frame changes according to wherever the timeline is right now, 91, 91. But it's a little bit too fast. As you can see, it's very hectic. So in order to make it slower, we can simply add a division. It's divided by, say, 35. And that looks so much better already. We can do the same in the other noise texture, #frame, divided by maybe 25 so that it can be a little bit faster. Yeah, this is good. The last thing we can do is we can play with the location axis. If you play with X or Y, then it moves basically in X and Y direction. But if you play with the Z value, it moves in the up and down direction. So because it's a two-dimensional plane, it gives us this kind of phasing effect. So we can also add a driver to it. So again, #frame divided by maybe 50, so that it's a little bit slower. And yeah, I think this is quite alright. You can always play with the scale a bit, but it's a bit smaller. That's fine. So yeah, let's add a emission shader at the end. And this part of the branch is done. Let's also connect it to the surface. Let's bring the string up maybe like 3. And in order to see bloom, you need to go to the render properties and enable bloom. So you can also control the intensity here. I will leave it as default. And now we can move on to the next part of the graph, which is gonna be the mask. That's gonna basically tell us where the effect should appear. So first of all, we need to get rid of those jagged edges. And in order to do that, we will need a math node. Let's change from add to smooth minimum. And now the value is basically gonna tell us how bright the brightest point should be. So we can put it at 1. And distance is gonna be, basically as you bring it up, it's gonna call the mask, the distance from the center of the object. So let's maybe make it something like this. And now this is very regular because it's a sphere and it's a circle. We can add a little bit of variation to it as well, so that the pattern isn't gonna be too obvious. In order to do that, we will need another noise texture. Again, Ctrl T to get ourselves the texture coordinate. And the mapping node, let's change the mapping from generated to object. And also let's do that as well here. And now we'll probably need to adjust our scale as well. Yep, because now everything is super small. So let's play around with this scale, bring it down. Something like 0.3 maybe. Maybe even smaller. 0.15. One more thing we can actually do here is in the Voronoi texture, the smooth F1, we can bring down the smoothness a little bit. And this will sort of disconnect the thinnest arcs, but I think it may be actually a good thing. It gives us sort of this sparky look instead of like fully connected arcs. So I think it's nice, but you can adjust it to your liking. Okay, so let's go back to our mask. So far we have this very regular circular mask, but we can add a mix RGB node. Let's change the mode to overlay and plug it in. And from noise texture, let's use the factor, because the factor is basically black and white values, while the color is the RGB output, and in this case we need just the black and white. And as you can see, let's crank it up all the way up. We start having some variations. Let's bring down the scale a little bit here. And we can add a color ramp after to get ourselves some contrast. And right now we don't need to worry about the gray values, because at the end the mask is gonna be only black and white, so we can make it a little bit noisy, and in the end it will all sort itself out, sort of. And we can also animate this as well. So let's change it from 3D to 4D, the noise texture. Let's add another driver, divided by 50, let's say. Oh, that's way too slow. Maybe 20. Okay, and here's the first problem. As you can see, as the timeline progresses, the area is basically, the mask area is getting bigger and bigger and more regular. And this is because when you try to move this object, you can see that it's painting this plane, but it doesn't dissolve behind itself. And it only disappears when the timeline goes to the end and resets at 0. And that is because we need to enable the automatic dissolving. So go into the plane, and again in the physics tab where we have the dynamic paint canvas, you need to check the dissolve. Let's open it, and you see here time. Let's set it to something like 30. This basically is time in frames. How long should the vertex stay colored once it's being affected by the brush? So 30 I found is a good number. So now if we click play and we move around this ball, then we see a slight trail. The faster you move, the bigger the trail, obviously. But I feel like the disappearing is quite good for the effect that we're going for. But feel free to experiment by yourself. So having this done, let's go back to the plane again. And now we can apply the mask to our electricity effect. So first of all, we will need a math node that goes after the color ramp, and let's change it from add to greater than. And the threshold we can set to something small, maybe like 0. And here's what I was talking about earlier. The mask ultimately is gonna be black and white values. So as you bring the threshold up, then the mask is gonna get reduced, because basically the threshold tells us which values should stay white and which one should be black. So in this case, only values of 0.44 and higher of this original mask coming from color ramp is gonna stay white. Everything else is gonna be cut to black. So we can set it to 0, so basically anything higher than 0, so non-black, basically is gonna be our pure white mask. I hope it all makes sense what I just said. So the next thing is we need to add a transparent VSDF and a mix shader. And let's connect both of the emission and the transparent. And the factor is gonna be our ultimate mask. So we need to take this and now apply this electricity effect only on this area. So for that we need another math node. Let's plug the color ramp to it, and again greater than 0. So we have just the black and white cutout, and then one more math node. The last one is gonna be multiply. So we are basically multiplying this with this, and the result should give you something like that. So the electricity is only visible near the object. And now this last multiply, let's plug it into the mix shader factor, and if we preview that, oh, there is a mistake. So you see now the electricity is everywhere but near the object, and that is because the emission and transparent needs to be switched. Yeah, now this is what we were going for, but as you see it's not transparent but black. This is simply because you need to go to material properties and in blend mode change the opaque to alpha clip, so that we basically allow this shader to have transparency and not be fully opaque. We can jump into the shading view, and now if we crank up the emission, so like 5, maybe even 10. And you see this bloom is giving us a really nice effect. Now is also time to play around with the values of the electricity itself. If you don't like how it looks like, everything is adjustable. So we can like crank up the noisiness and the scale of the little ones. Maybe that's too much. Something like this, it's very aggressive, I would say. High voltage stuff. As you can see, if you like scale up the sphere, then the effect follows, but it doesn't get bigger. In order to get the mask itself basically covering a bigger area, you need to go with the sphere selected to the physics tab of the brush, and then in distance you have to play with this value. This is basically gonna extend our overall distance of the effect. So let's go into layout. And if you copy the object, you can have as many of them as you want. And as you move them around, you see that the electricity itself connects, because it's basically driven by the same noise. It's just one and the same noise being masked out. So I think it gives a nice result. And we have those tails, but obviously it only works within the confines of the original square itself. So as soon as you move outside, you don't have the effect anymore. So yeah, this is the basic of the 2D plane electricity effect. But as you see, it would be nice to have the effect in a 3-dimensional space as well, not only on the flat plane. And with just small tweaks, we can make that happen as well. So first of all, let's add another mesh. Let it be the monkey. Let's also maybe give it new material. And we can actually give it some very simple tune shader so that we can see what's going on. Let's get layer weight and color ramp. This is like the very basic setup for any tune shading. So we can use it wherever. Let's use the Fresnel to color ramp, change from linear to constant. Let's also change the shading to smooth and maybe add more geometry. Okay. Now we can just lay in some values. Yeah, something like this. Okay, just so that we can see in the viewport where our object is. So now let's duplicate this object and using right mouse button to put it in the same place as the original. Now hit S and scale it up a little bit so that it's outside of the original mesh. And let's assign it the electricity material. And same as with plane, we need to give this object a dynamic paint modifier and canvas. Delete the paint map layer and the wet map layer and create a new one again in the object data properties. In vertex color, click this plus button. And back into the dynamic paint. In the paint map layer, let's choose the group that we just created. Let's also click the dissolve and change it to 30. Same as we had with the plane, basically. Now, as you can see, the effect disappeared because there is no brush that would tell us where the effect should be visible. So the monkey needs to have dynamic paint modifier as well. And it's not canvas but brush. Let's add brush. And paint mode, let's change from mesh volume to mesh volume plus proximity. And in the distance we will be able to control where it gets affected, so that now if you scale up the effect mesh, so the outer mesh, you can see that as it gets away from our brush mesh, the effect disappears, and that's exactly what we want. But now if you click play, then it does look like electricity, maybe, but we can make it look much better. So first of all, let's go to the shading editor, and again, because previously we were working on plane with different size, different scale, in here we need to adjust the values as well. Let me make it a bit smaller. Yeah, as you can see, it's much better, but we can improve it even more. So let's go to this effect mesh, and in modifier tab, let's add a displace modifier and drag it in before the dynamic paint, and hit new texture. And in the texture tab, let's change the type from to clouds. We can also change the size, something like this maybe. And now all we need to do is basically animate this displace modifier. So again, as I did in basically all of my previous videos, add an empty, plane axis is okay. Also let's add a path. Let's drag it up here. Now select the empty, go into constraints and choose the constraint follow path, the path being the one that we just created. And now in the timeline on the first frame, let's hover over offset and click I, which will give us a keyframe on this first frame with this value. And then let's move the timeline to the last frame, change the value to something like 100. And again, with mouse over the value, let's click I, which will give us another keyframe. Let's hover over timeline and click T to make sure that the interpolation between those keyframes is linear, not Bezier. I believe it's Bezier by default. So just click linear. Now, if you click play, you should be able to see the empty moving along the line. Let's move it a little bit down so that it's on the same level. Now, the next thing that we have to do is click the effect mesh, go into the modifiers, and in the displace modifier, change the coordinates from local to object, and the object being the empty that is moving along the path. So now if you click play, you can see that the mesh is moving, but the electricity shader is not being affected by it that much. And in order to change that, we have to simply play with the strength so that the mesh basically goes in and out of the range of the brush. We can also scale it down, play with the mid-level. And again, now it's too much, so we can go back to the shading and bring down the scale. Maybe also play with the color burn and color dodge. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, there is lots of different values to play with to achieve different results. So you can adjust it however you like, but that's what I'm gonna finish at. Again, the file that you've seen at the beginning of the video is gonna be available on my Gumroad for free, so go check that out, link in the description again. And yeah, I mean, I'm super curious on what you will do with this. If you manage to make the tutorial by yourself, then feel free to tag me on my socials, like either Twitter or Instagram. All the links are in the description. So yeah, I would love to see your creative vision for it. And if you want the electricity effect to follow your original mesh, simply click on the effect mesh, then on the original mesh, and parent those two using parent object. And now, if you move it, then the electricity effect moves along. However, I don't know how to get this trail when it's not on the plane. So if anyone knows or has idea how we could achieve it in the 3D space, same as we had it on the plane, then please let me know, because I would love to have that as well. So yeah, that's it for today. Hope you liked it and learned something useful, and I will see you on the next one.